I wanted to start by asking you about New Zealand's strategy, because New Zealand seems to be one of the very few countries, and perhaps the only Western country, that has gone for this elimination strategy. I wanted to ask you to briefly outline, give me the definition of this elimination strategy and what main components does it entail?
Well, the idea of eliminating infectious diseases is very well established. That approach has been used, obviously, for smallpox. The world is pursuing it for polio and has almost achieved global eradication. But elimination basically means the absence of an infectious disease in a particular country or region. So that's the approach New Zealand's gone for. It's also it's sometimes called containment, and a number of countries, particularly in Asia, are very successfully following the same path to containment and actually have achieved elimination. And in New Zealand, we've defined elimination as 28 days or more with no confirmed cases. And we can show with modelling that there's a very low chance there's circulating virus once you have got to that point. But of course, you also have to have a high-performing surveillance system, because if you're not looking for the virus, you may not find it. So the definition has those two parts. And also we have to exclude cases that are just detected at the border and returning New Zealanders, because we have a 2-week quarantine period at the border, and a small number of those people are incubating the virus and become ill or have it detected, and so they don't become part of the count for elimination. It's really concerned with transmission within New Zealand.
And why did you decide to embark on this strategy, given that many other Western nations opted for a more sort of light touch managing strategy? What prompted New Zealand to adopt this particular way of tackling the virus?
Yeah, well, there was an interesting point. When New Zealand really was on, we'd say, the knife edge, it had to decide what to do, because we had seen some cases. Our first case was at the end of February. And then by early March, we were starting to see a lot of cases. And we were seeing imported cases, but then we started to see community transmission. So some of us, people like myself, were looking at the experience of Asia, where containment was working very well. And so we said, well, New Zealand should pursue elimination rather than what you call mitigation. And our influenza pandemic plan is about mitigation on the basis you can't stop an influenza pandemic. So instead, I concluded that this was more like a SARS virus, and the experience in Asia showed it could be stopped. And so myself and a small number of other colleagues persuaded the government this was the best way to go. And we fortunately had a very open and, I think, effective government and Prime Minister who then adopted this approach. And then the officials rolled out a very intense lockdown. We had to do that because we didn't have all of the other capabilities at that point in time. We weren't doing enough testing or contact tracing, and our borders, we didn't have full quarantine at that point. So we then had this very intense lockdown, and it achieved a number of things. And the main thing it did, it basically put the whole country effectively into home quarantine for almost 6 weeks, and that extinguished most of the chains of transmission. It also gave us time to increase our testing hugely, up to 5,000 to 10,000 tests a day. This is for a population of 5 million people. And also the contact tracing became very good. And the other thing it did was suddenly we all know about physical distancing. And so that was something we had to learn, because no one in New Zealand had ever been through a pandemic like this before. So the end result then, we've been coming out of lockdown by it's a 4-level alert system, going down the levels. And just on yesterday, in fact, we finally went to level 1, which means no physical distancing requirements. The only restriction now is at the borders, and we still have quarantine for people coming into New Zealand. Well, I think New Zealand succeeded with 3 things. Managing borders, a very intense lockdown, which of course we've come out of that, so we hopefully won't need to do that again. And thirdly, contact tracing, testing and contact tracing. They were the 3 critical measures. And I think if we had a widespread culture of mask use, we might have been able to contain it without lockdown. I think that would be something that we'll need to analyse whether that would have happened.
And on Monday, New Zealand's government decided to lift, as you said, the majority and if not all of the restrictions. How positive are you that New Zealand can manage the situation and avoid the second wave emerging? Because many suggested it's just impossible to control people on the borders. They may be asymptomatic and they may infect others on the plane, and here it goes again, we have a second wave. And also, how do you police those who come into the country? How do you make sure that they quarantine for 2 weeks? I mean, what's your take on that? And could you just outline what's New Zealand's strategy in that regard?
Well, firstly, the borders now are critical because that's the only way cases, I think, can appear in New Zealand. And to come into New Zealand now, firstly, you can only come if you're actually a New Zealand citizen or resident, except for certain exemptions. And there's still very small numbers, essential workers, sometimes humanitarian reasons. So the numbers are really tiny. And as I say, they go through 14 days of quarantine, which is very effective. New Zealand's now added additional testing of people in quarantine coming in. So that's highly controlled. The problems really are going to be that there's pressure to open up the borders more and for greater numbers of people going through quarantine, and also the potential for quarantine-free travel from other places that have eliminated the virus. And that would be Australia, which is heading down the same path, and some Pacific Islands. So I think we'll see more people coming in, and that, of course, means there will be more risk. The other thing is we're going through winter. We have no other barriers to stop the disease except for quite a bit of testing, and of course we've got contact tracing set up and available. But we don't have widespread use of masks, face masks, which I think is a valuable defence in Asian countries and increasingly around the globe. And we think contact tracing could probably be improved.
And you're positive that New Zealand can stay sort of virus-free till the vaccine arrives?
I think we have to plan for the occasional failure, because in health protection, you always think you need a multi-barrier approach, and it's the same in aviation and other areas where safety is very important. You need additional backups and safeguards. That seems to be how safety works. And I think with this virus, we need to plan for system failures and getting cases and perhaps outbreaks. I don't think we will see a severe outbreak in New Zealand. I think we have enough safeguards to prevent that happening.
And when do you expect the vaccine, the vaccine to be developed?
Well, so many questions about vaccines. It may be antivirals. They may actually be more useful because if you could treat COVID-19 pneumonia in the same way you treat a bacterial pneumonia, it wouldn't necessarily be life-threatening anymore, and that would change things hugely. So that's one possibility. Vaccines, the uncertainties are, I think we will find a vaccine, but the question will be how long is the protective immunity for?
And why do you think other Western countries didn't take this approach? Is it because of their sort of reluctance of their politicians, or is it because probably they already accumulated so many cases by the time they discovered the disease that actually going for elimination strategy would not have been viable anyway? What's your view on that?
Yeah, I think the Western world has hugely underestimated this virus. I think it was a major failure of risk assessment. And normally in New Zealand, we're an English-speaking OECD country. We usually look to the West for leadership, particularly the US CDC, Public Health England, European Centers for Disease Control, and of course the World Health Organization. And they were not saying, we think you should shut your borders or manage them. We've never absolutely shut our border. It's just greatly reduced people coming in and they have to go through quarantine. But the World Health Organization was not saying that. They were saying, keep your borders open. And they also weren't saying face masks work, and they really do work. So we're looking for leadership there, and I think we got the wrong messages about how to manage this threat. So instead, we started to look more to Asia. I mean, the success of mainland China and Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and particularly Taiwan. And they have really had, I think, outside China, mainland China, I think they've had the best single response, because they started acting early in January to manage their borders, and they were using face masks and their quarantine and contact tracing. They did everything right. And as a result, they've had the lowest mortality rate, I think, of any high-income country. They've done extremely well, and they avoided the need for a lockdown.
Also wanted to ask you about Swedish approach. According to their, initially they recommended that Sweden go for herd immunity approach, but apparently that hasn't been working. What's your take on this Swedish methods of tackling the virus, and whether it might work in the future or it's a dead end?
Yeah, it's a very good question, because of course when we were looking around in March for how to respond, there was a lot of interest by some people in New Zealand in the so-called herd immunity approach, or mitigation, where you don't suppress transmission as much. And I think at that point, the UK, Netherlands, and Sweden were talking about that approach. And I think only Sweden has really stayed with it. I think at that point, it wasn't clear what was going to be the most effective strategy for those countries. And I think in the end, Sweden did make the wrong decision, but they made assumptions that turned out not to be correct. And I guess the three assumptions are that you could still manage the deaths by protecting vulnerable people, and they have not been very good at that. Secondly, that the wave of infection would create herd immunity. And again, it doesn't seem to do that very effectively. And the third thing is that your economy would do much better if it was more open. And again, I don't think that has proven to be that correct. So it made these assumptions, and I do know some of the people there, and I think I respect them as scientists, but it turned out these were the wrong assumptions at that point. But, they could have been right. Some of those assumptions could have been correct. And their argument, I think, had some validity that only time would tell. In 1 or 2 years' time, you can look back. And their argument was that Sweden would be in a better position as a result. And that's the difficulty of making decisions when you have incomplete information.
And how would you respond to still quite a popular opinion in Russia and many other countries that basically this virus isn't very dangerous? So what's the point of expending all this sort of treasure and all this time and sacrificing people's social lives to stop the virus? Because everyone will have it at some point, so why bother? And that basically, even if you don't have it, if you don't have any underlying diseases, it's probably going to be fine. What would you respond to that, people? And in what ways do you think they're mistaken? Is it that probably the impact of the virus is underestimated, that it may actually be more cause complications that have some lifelong consequences? Or there are other, counterpoints to that argument that you can think of?
Yeah, well, I guess this is one of those areas where you're going to balance some benefits and costs of acting. But over time, I think the more we know about this virus, I think the more concerning it gets, the picture. This is a virus that may keep circulating and keep claiming lives year after year unless we can find some way of stopping it. And it's also it's not just disruptive for in terms of its health effects, but it's very disruptive for societies and economies. And basically, I think one of the huge benefits of eliminating the virus, if you do it quickly, of course, you've got the obvious health benefits. You have fewer cases, fewer deaths. But also, if you come out into a virus-free country, it's also very good for business because they can get on with, they have certainty about how they're going to operate. And I just think, I'm not quite sure how societies will function long-term if they've still got the threat of circulating virus constantly.
I can't remember which article was it, but I think it was in the Guardian article that you mentioned that probably not all countries can go for elimination strategy, and it generally requires sort of high-income country. And I wanted to ask you, what's your take on Russia? Should Russia have taken sort of more unambiguously pro-elimination strategy, and do you think it's still possible for Russia to basically contain the virus and to eliminate it? And should it try to do that instead of sort of managing it?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. It's hard for me to understand all of the facts operating in other countries. I mean, technically, any country could eliminate this virus now if it chose to, but certain things would have to be in place. And I think you really have to have the committed leadership, and I think you have to have the trust of the population and their engagement with it, because ultimately it's essential that people will do something which is really not natural for us, and that is to go through an intense lockdown to extinguish the virus. And then you have to have enough resources and infrastructure to run contact tracing so you can stamp out remaining cases. And I think border management can really be achieved almost anywhere. There are probably some very porous borders in Africa where it would be difficult, but certainly if we look at low-income countries like Vietnam and Mongolia and Thailand, again, have done this very effectively. I mean, Russia is obviously a completely different, it's really very much an emerging economy and a wealthy country. So, and whether you're going to go the European way or more looking to examples from Asia, it might be that different parts of Russia do things differently because it's obviously the largest country in the world with a very diverse regions.
And New Zealand lifted restrictions when you had basically no cases of transmission for quite a while. I'm looking at the news now, and I'm seeing in the news that yesterday it was, I mean, more than 8,000 cases of infected people were registered yesterday. And today in Moscow, we see the lifting of restrictions on travel, on many other businesses, and all the businesses in public places are reopening. Do you think having about 8,000 new cases and reopening, do you think that's sort of reasonable thing to do? Or should have Russia maybe waited more and perhaps to decrease the rate of transmission further before reopening?
Well, I think if you open up an economy where you still have thousands of cases occurring, you know exactly what will happen. It will take off again. And it's just inevitable from everything we know about this virus. And once you have all of those cases across the country will be connected to other cases. And once you reduce the level of containment, come out of lockdown, all of those cases will start new chains of transmission. And really, I think people have underestimated how few people have been infected. This virus is only really getting started in most countries, and it's going to keep going and going. Eventually, I mean, a rough estimate would be that it will kill 20 to 30 million people across the planet, maybe more, and it will keep going for years, potentially, unless we find some way of stopping it. And I do wonder if we don't see progress with antivirals or vaccines, that we may consider, I mean, countries may have to seriously consider systematically eliminating the virus. Because remember, if you put a population down into a very carefully planned, well-run, intense lockdown for 4 to 6 weeks, that you can eliminate the virus. And that's what happened in New Zealand. It might have to be a bit longer than that, but it's possible, and you can model that.
From what you said, it's quite obvious sort of to put forward this notion that you think that probably, I mean, later on in the summer or in the autumn, we will get quite sort of a new second wave of disease in Europe and in Russia, given that countries are reopening, having several thousands of new cases every day.
It does seem inevitable to me, because almost everyone is still susceptible, so they're not immune. There are hundreds or maybe even thousands of active cases in the population that can each, most of which are capable of starting more outbreaks. So I think it's a bit like taking the cork off a bottle of sparkling wine. You know, it's going at a certain point, it's just going to erupt out again. There's nothing that I know of that can stop that. Unless people, when they come out of lockdown, are practicing great physical distancing and using face masks very effectively, that may be enough to really control it at that point, plus some contact tracing and isolation of cases. So I think that may be enough if countries are really committed to that.
So I think it's possible to avoid the second wave, even if you have thousands of cases, but if you do wear masks and you do proper contact tracing, basically.
Yeah, and I think if you have a lockdown which does basically extinguish as many chains of transmission, then it means that it's more manageable if you do see small numbers of cases and outbreaks. So I think the combination of all those things, if it's very well organized, could be really effective.
And obviously, Australian government was quite vocal in its criticism of China, and more on China than on WHO. Do you have, and does New Zealand government have any opinion whatsoever on how well China acted during the outbreak of this pandemics, and whether WHO played did they act in an adequate manner, or did they probably mess things up a little bit? What's your take on that?
Well, I think it's a mixed picture with China, isn't it? That they still allow wet markets where animals can mix and share viruses, and that is known as a great incubator of pandemic diseases. So I think that's a problem. Hopefully China will fix that, and other Asian countries will deal with that problem, particularly after this disaster. The other thing is Chinese scientists did do very well early on. They did sequence the virus. They made information available. But then there seemed to be a period when things went very quiet in China, and it looked like there was some control of information. There seemed to be no new cases for 1 or 2 weeks. It seemed very odd. And then scientists outside China were saying, well, look, we're seeing these cases that have been exported from China. And it was quite simple maths to say, if we're seeing that number of people exported, there must be thousands of cases in China to generate that number of exported cases. So I remember reading those accounts, that was in mid-January, and thinking, wow, there is something really going on there. And China was not being very open at that point. And I think that is really one of several tragedies, because at that point, the pandemic was containable. If everywhere had acted, it could have been just a phenomenon, I think, not entirely confined to China, because there were already cases in January, probably in Europe and other places. But if we'd all acted really quickly at that point, I think it was containable. And I think the World Health Organization was saying, I think right up to mid-February, yes, we think it's very much a containable pandemic. But I think after that point, it wasn't containable.